The situation is very simply put, it is insupportable, and to allow it to continue would be a travesty. Civilians must be protected, their essential needs met wherever they are and wherever they decide to be. The United Nations cannot be part of a unilateral proposal to push hundreds of thousands of desperate civilians in Gaza into so-called safe zones. We cannot be part of this.
We can now bring in our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. Doug, you heard there from Martin Griffiths, who said the situation is very simply insupportable. He used the French word to drive his point across to the French president, clearly making some in that room quite uncomfortable with what he had to say.
Well, not just what he has to say. The UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs has just said earlier today that as of this Thursday, all of Gaza's 120 municipal water wells are slated to shut down. And they're slated to shut down because they don't have fuel to run, not enough fuel, if any, is really getting to them. Why is that a big deal? That's a big deal because that's the UN saying it. Now, the World Health Organization takes that information and is warning of, it's already seeing, in fact, a surge, as they see it, a spike in diseases such as chickenpox, such as scabies, such as diarrhea, especially in children under the age of 5, which is even more dangerous when you're of that very young age, and other diseases, as you have deteriorating hygienic conditions, lack of sanitation, overcrowded conditions, all of it compounded by this lack of fuel to have clean water, to treat water plants, these water wells shutting down. I will note that the Rafah border crossing, we've been talking about that, the aid trucks coming in. The Jordanian, I believe it was the Jordanian representative at today's conference, addressed the aid getting through Rafah. Now, he said that before, we keep talking about this number, before October 7th, before this latest war, about 500 humanitarian aid convoys were getting through on average a day. Now that's down to, if we're lucky, Delano, if we're lucky, 100. He said, but even before the conflict, we're holding up that 500 number as if it's an ideal target. He said even then it was severely inadequate, the 500 getting through. And right now, as of the time I'm standing here speaking to you, when we're talking about water, going back to the question of life-sustaining water, we all need to drink water, only 4%, that's less than 1/20th of Gaza's water needs are being met at the moment by water trucks and aid trucks coming through at Rafah. That gives you just a little snapshot of one aspect of the humanitarian calamity.
I spoke to someone yesterday who said we're wasting a space on those humanitarian convoys with plastic water bottles because they need them for Gaza. Let's talk about, we're talking about the situation in Gaza, which is very important. The conference today happening in Paris, but also the situation in the West Bank, which continues to worsen. Just today we had 5 Palestinians killed in Jenin.
It's hard to keep track, the latest numbers, and everyone, risks just becoming another statistic, right? We throw out a number here, a number there. Look, since October 7th, the number of Palestinians, and remember, there's millions of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, more than actually the 2.5 million in Gaza. Since October 7th, over 160, at least 160 Palestinians have been killed in violence, predominantly due to Israeli army raids that had been ongoing almost nightly in various parts of the West Bank, even before October 7th, but which have become even more prevalent or perhaps more noticeable since October 7th. But also, and this is what's really attracted the attention of a lot of the Europe and U.S. and the international community, is these attacks by illegal Israeli settlers. I'm using the word illegal because under international law, they're not recognized, these settlements, and the settlers are often armed, and they are there illegally. Most of them, perhaps not all of them, but most of them are there for ideological reasons because they believe that that is their land going back to biblical times. They have a birthright to be there. No one is going to force them to leave, and they are willing to defend that right as they see it to be there with arms. And they've been using those arms, according to the reports of Palestinians on the ground, organizations on the ground, reporters on the ground. So over 160 killed. Joe Biden himself has warned against this alarming spike in settler attacks in the West Bank, and this is perhaps really the focus of concern right now, especially what the U.S. has labeled. Even the U.S. Has labeled this, for all its pro-Israeli stance, U.S. alarmed at what it seems as extremist violence by these illegal armed settlers in the West Bank targeting Palestinians.
We'll see if the Israelis actually act on that. I want to take you back to the conference because, of course, France is playing host to this Gaza aid conference. France has been in a tricky position because at one point it is seeing what is going on the ground in Gaza, in the West Bank, but at the same time, President Emmanuel Macron reiterating Israel's right to defend itself.
Yeah, listen, this conference, from Israel's standpoint, Europe's voice is not that loud. At the end of the day, we know it's become cliche to say it, all roads lead to Washington when it comes to any chance, however remote it might be, of having an influence on Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet to at least rethink their course. It's not Europe, it's not Emmanuel Macron sitting in France. That's not to say it isn't an initiative perhaps that a lot of people don't think absolutely needed to be taken. There's never any harm talking about humanitarian aid, given what we were talking about before. It is a dire, calamitous need right now. However, within France, within the government itself, there are reports, a lot of the French news outlets reporting, there's friction within the French foreign policy establishment between those who see Macron's stance as being too pro-Israel, forcing him into this very, very untenable, delicate tightrope act, this balancing act between, as Washington's doing, perhaps even more vocally, defending Israel's right to defend itself, while at the same time stressing the absolute dire need to protect civilians on the ground and get humanitarian aid in. A lot of people say, in the France's foreign policy establishment, not quoted, but off the record, they'll say it's absurd not to call for a ceasefire, as many of the Arab leaders and people that Blinken was meeting with last week were calling for.